Today I'm beginning a brand new series I'm calling Don't Give Up on Your Dreams. And it's based on the life of quite a famous man in the Old Testament by the name of Joseph, a man whose family actually nicknamed him the Dreamer. And why his story is important for us in our day and time is because too many people today have virtually given up on their dreams. What with COVID and lockdowns and mandates and talk of recession and an unthinkable rise in violence, many people have just placed their dreams on the back burner or really just given up on them altogether. But here's one of the great things about the story of Joseph. His story is about how dreams still come true even when life turns him upside down and inside out. Because let me tell you about Joseph. Here was this fella whose life was filled with crazy after crazy after crazy, yet things always just seemed to work out. His dreams always just seemed to come true. Did you ever know anyone like that? Someone who always seemed to land on their feet, for instance? I mean, for you get knocked down, it takes you 6 months, 5 work crews, and a forklift to get you back up on your feet, right? While there's that other person in your life and they get knocked down and the very next day it's ta-da, and they're back going again, back on their feet. That was Joseph. Now, early on in his life, God began giving Joseph dreams. Dreams of success, dreams of prosperity, of happiness. By the way, those are the best kind of dreams, right? And though his dreams all came to pass, Joseph still had his share of stuff to endure and work through. All right, let's just jump in here today. I'm calling this message, this first one, Life in the Pit, and I think you'll see why in just a moment. I want to give you 3 things concerning Joseph. First off, his father favored him. In Genesis chapter 37, it says this, Joseph was a young man of 17, tending his flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, or literally Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Now, favoritism is nothing new in Genesis. In fact, Isaac was favored over Ishmael. Jacob was favored over Esau, his brother. It's like a pattern that runs in each generation. So it was nothing in Jacob's mind to show favoritism to Joseph. Kind of like the old Hank Williams song. It was a family tradition. And remember this, Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines. And of those 4, his favorite, the love of his life, was Rachel. So what happens is Rachel dies in childbirth with their second son, Reuben. And from that point on, Jacob lavished all of his love and attention on his firstborn by Rachel, who was Joseph. And one proof of that is verse 3 here that I just read, where Jacob gives Joseph this fancy smancy coat. It was long and flowing, ornate, very expensive. And Joseph was the only son out of the 13 who got one of the coats. Now, a lot of things we could say here, but I want you to think about this one. You cannot hide who or what you favor. You just can't. I mean, I can come and hang out with you for a minute or come to your home or office and get a pretty good handle on who or what you favor. And you could do the same thing with me. And sometimes that's a good thing, but other times, well, not so much. Because like Jesus said, where your treasure is, there is your heart also. So you say, Pastor, should I be evaluating that in my own life? Should I be checking myself about where my treasure is and who and what I favor? I would answer you absolutely. That's a great thing to do. However, something even better would be for you to ask those closest to you, hey, what do you see in me? Where do you see my treasure? What or who do I favor? What do you think they would say? If you ask them those kinds of questions, how do you think they would respond? For Jacob, his treasure was Joseph. Listen, to the exclusion of all the rest of his other children. I mentioned this coat was long, ankle length long, with long sleeves. It was richly decorated. It was precisely what a king would wear in this day. So here's Joseph strutting around in his fancy coat that made it virtually impossible for him to do any of the work, while at the same time sending a message to his brothers that, hey, Father loves me better than all you people. Now, what do you think that did for all of his brothers? Well, watch this. His father favored him, but number two, his brothers hated him. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Have you ever had a situation where there was animosity between you and another person? And it was very difficult, wasn't it, to speak peacefully to them or peaceably to them? That was what was happening here. By giving this coat, Jacob was not only saying, my favorite son is exempt from all the work, but also he was saying, my favorite son is your boss. Wow, that must have been really hard to take for these brothers, you know. Joseph is no boss or leader, as of yet, at least. He's basically a 17-year-old shepherd who was 12th out of 13 of the children. And all of a sudden, old dad says, hey guys, it's all about Joseph here. No wonder they hated him, but it gets worse. In verse 5, it says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told the dream to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So not only is Joseph their boss, but one day he's prophesying that he will rule them. And notice here in these verses, 3 times, verses 4, 5, and 8, is that word hate. Born out of jealousy. It is growing in these brothers like lava, about to blow the top off of this family. And it's interesting that after 17 years of seeing this, verse 4 says they could not speak peacefully to him. In this culture, by the way, if you did not greet a person, it was a way of saying, we don't want you in our group. We exclude you. So Joseph never got any words from his brothers. No hellos, no goodbyes, no good morning, Joseph, or hey, great to see you. None of that. And even if Joseph tried to talk nicely to them, they ignored him. This is crazy. And a dysfunctional family, a really dysfunctional family, isn't it? If there was a daytime soap opera, this would probably be an Emmy winner. But it even gets worse. Verse 2 said Joseph was a young man of 17, tending his flocks with his brothers, and he brought their father a bad report about them, about the brothers. Now, the word for bad report is translated slander. In other words, he went to his father and slandered his brothers to the father. And to be sure, his brothers did have their faults, but rather than sitting down and talking with them about the faults, Joseph ran and tattled to his dad. He overlooked and or ignored his own faults, but he was very quick to point out theirs. It's like that Peanuts cartoon. Lucy's always giving Linus a hard time, right? In one strip, Linus asks Lucy, why are you always so anxious to criticize me? And Lucy replied, well, I just have a knack for seeing other people's faults. And Linus responds, well, what about your own faults? Lucy smiles and says to him, well, I have a knack for overlooking those. Hey, have you ever known anyone like that? Critical, a fault finder, yet blind to their own inconsistencies. And then these dreams. The dreams of him being some sort of ruler, where even his family would bow down and acknowledge him. I mean, that had to be really unsettling for the brothers. In fact, it was, and sent them over the edge. Listen to this. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these wells, these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams." So they're talking of killing young Joseph. And then Reuben intervenes in the conversation and says, "Hey guys, how about this? How about we don't kill Joseph? How about we put Joseph in this well, but let's just don't kill him?" And another brother, Judah, jumped in and said, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea, because while we were eating, I saw a caravan of traders heading to Egypt. Let's sell him to those traders and get the money instead of killing him." So that's what they did. Then they took the coat off of Joseph that they had taken off of Joseph. They took the coat, dipped it in animal blood, and took it to their father. Immediately the father, upon seeing them in the coat, asked them, "Is this Joseph's coat?" And they replied, "Yes, Father, an animal must have killed him." And notice how Jacob responded. Notice his response in verse 34. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the traders sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, isn't this a sad, sad scene? Jacob was overwhelmed with grief and sorrow. I mean, what a messed up deal for all of this family, really. But get this. In the midst of all this grief and scheming and betrayal, all this bad news, there's also a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of good news. And the good news is that in the weeks to come, we will begin to see Joseph mature. We will see him throughout his story become this man of great faith, a man of integrity, one who has overcome all these childish attitudes that we're talking about today, that he developed as a favored one. And we will see him become a man any family would be proud of. Now, for just a few minutes before I stop today, let me personalize this introduction of Joseph by just asking, what do we do when our life takes a bad turn? When our life is in the pit? And there are any number of things that could be said, to be sure, but let me give you one that is a real must for you. When life goes sideways, okay? Are you ready? Here it is. When life takes a sudden bad turn, when life goes sideways, when you're in the pit, don't panic. Let me say that again. Don't panic. When you find yourself in an emotional pit, or a physical health pit, or a financial pit, relational pit, whatever, just don't panic. Because like with Joseph, God is already at work in ways you could never know in your behalf. He was at work in Joseph's life. In fact, he was already working in Egypt, preparing everything for Joseph to go to Egypt, and everything for Joseph's life to work out wonderfully there. Joseph couldn't see that at the time, but God was at work. By the way, how do you think God reacted when all this happened to Joseph? Do you think he turned to his angels maybe and said, "Oh, myself, did you see that? What in my name are we going to do now?" No way. That didn't happen. God never operates in a panic, does he? Yikes and oh no, those are things that are not even in his vocabulary. In fact, we know from later passages in Genesis that it was God's plan all along for Joseph to end up living in Egypt and living the life that he lived there. So what a coincidence that a caravan would just happen by. I mean, this was God's will for him to get to Egypt, so what a coincidence that this caravan would come by. And what a coincidence that it was headed to Egypt. And what a coincidence that it happened just as Judah came up with the idea of selling Joseph instead of killing him. My, coincidences. Wasn't Joseph lucky? Or wasn't Joseph blessed? Let me tell you about coincidences. What I've discovered in my own life is the more I am thankful for coincidences, the more I see God behind them, the more they just keep happening to me. Isn't that something? I bet you've seen the same thing. And incidentally, in every one of our difficulties, in every one of our pit experiences, there will be blessings and there will also be strengthenings. Because Romans 8:28 is still true today, where Paul said all things work together for what? For good to those who love Him. Now that's a promise from God. And how many of you know God will never, ever break His promises? The great grace preacher Charles Spurgeon once said, God is too good to be unkind, and He is too wise to be confused. If I cannot trace His hand, I can always trust His heart. And he was right. Spurgeon was right, because we can. God is ever faithful, even, or maybe especially, when we find ourselves in a pit. Now, Joseph probably did not believe that initially. In fact, we know the truth, he did not. But as his life played out, and as we shall see over the next weeks in this study, God's faithfulness became more than evident to him. And those dreams he had early on in his life, they all come to pass, every single one of them. Now listen, when life is just the pits for you, don't panic. Instead, just remember that God can always, always be trusted. Robert the Bruce was a Christian fighting in the Scottish Revolution in the 1300s. After a horrific battle where he and his fellow soldiers were soundly defeated, they began retreating and running away from the enemy. Robert was quickly pursued by soldiers. They were hunting him to finish him off because he was the apparent leader. So he had been running and hiding for days, and one night when he realized he was being surrounded by the soldiers, they were closing in on him, he saw a small cave in the side of a hill, and he crawled into it. It was only a shallow depression about maybe 6 feet deep. So it was not, it was not really a good hiding place. But he could hear the soldiers hunting for him, so he just couldn't risk taking off running through the forest. He feared he would be found and killed, so all he could do was lay there in that cave and hope and pray and stay very, very quiet. Well, at one point, Robert watched as a large spider began to weave a spider web over the opening to that cave. Within an hour or so, the spider had woven a beautiful lacework across the mouth of the cave. Soon afterward, the soldiers arrived looking for him, and as they looked toward the shallow cave, Robert feared that his life was over. But when the commander of the soldiers saw the spider's web, he told the soldiers to just move on. For he knew that it would be impossible for Robert to have entered that cave without breaking the spider's web. So the soldiers left, and Robert ultimately escaped. Later, as he reflected on this event, Robert the Bruce wrote this in his journal. He said, "Where God is, a spider's web is as a stone wall. Where God is not, a stone wall is as a spider's web." Now listen, you may find yourself in a pit, in a cave. You may find yourself in crazy land in your life. Life has gone askew for you, and you've given up on all of your dreams. Don't do that. First of all, don't panic. And in the midst of not panicking, remember that God is with you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. And God is looking after you. Those coincidences will begin to happen. Things will begin to make sense. And God's will become apparent to you. He is always there. He is ever there. And He is ever by your side. Well, I'm going to quit right now, and we're going to pick this up the next week. Thank you for being with me today. Spread this around on your social media pages, if you will, and if I can help you with anything, answer any questions, pray for you, please send me an email at our website, newdaychurchbrandon.org, or a personal message on your favorite social media page, and I'll get right back to you, okay? God bless you. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.